First, on a personal note, I'd like to welcome all our new admittees to the South Dakota State Bar. I hope you find it as rewarding as I have. I'd like to welcome all of you to the program Cultural Competency, a primer for the South Dakota lawyer. This program is jointly presented by the South Dakota Young Lawyers section, as well as the State Bar Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and it's a part of the Nuts and Bolts CLE program. Today, you are in for a dynamic presentation on a topic of critical importance. Our program will peel back the layers of common concepts in the diversity, equity, and inclusion realm and break down their meaning, intent, and impact. Most importantly, our panel will give you insight on how these concepts can inform and enrich your practice. My name is Tamara Nash, and I have the honor of being your moderator today. And we are also joined by an all-star panel. And at this time, I would invite each of our panelists to turn on their video and their mic if they have not already done so. Oh, I see they have. Awesome. At this time, I'd like to introduce our panel. First, we welcome Dr. Laura Renee Chandler, who serves as the director of the University of South Dakota's Center for Diversity and Community in Vermillion, South Dakota. Next, Kiva Sam is a doctoral student at USD's School for Psychology. Kiva is a citizen of the Ogallala Sioux Tribe and holds an MA in Lakota Leadership and Management. And finally, we welcome one of our own, Cesar Juarez, who's an attorney with Lynn Jackson in Sioux Falls. And notably, Cesar is one of the very few fluent Spanish-speaking attorneys here in South Dakota. And currently, he is our fearless leader as co-chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. So with that, welcome to our speakers. Now, before we dive too deep in content today, I'd like to open up the conversation with each of our speakers and invite you to share briefly about your backgrounds and what perspectives are going to inform the opinions and the knowledge you'll share with our panel, or our audience rather, today. And to kick it off, we'll do hometown advantage. Cesar, would you like to share first?
Sure, it's my pleasure. Good afternoon, everybody. As my friend Tamara said, my name is Cesar Juarez. I'm a lawyer here in Sioux Falls with the law firm of Lynn Jackson. I've been practicing for 8 years now. I graduated in 2011 and clerked for a year here in the Second Circuit. But before that, let me tell you about the various. During our conversation today, you will hear quite a bit about diversity, inclusion, equity, in these terms that we'll be talking about. I have the privilege of checking several boxes on that diversity checklist. So let me tell you about some of those. I was born and raised in Mexico. I moved to the US when I was 14 years old. I moved to South Sioux City, Nebraska, went to college in Yankton, South Dakota, and decided to make South Dakota home. So I checked a few different boxes on diversity there because I'm not from the US. If you're looking at me in the video, you can probably tell I don't look like probably a lot of you. I probably sound different than most of you. Spanish is my first language. And when I go to national conferences, then I also get to check the box of diversity because I live in South Dakota. So that is, in a nutshell, what perspective I hope to bring to this panel today. And I hope that each of you takes something away from our conversation today.
Awesome, thank you. Dr. Chandler, how about you? What are you bringing to the table?
Sure. Well, hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here with you this afternoon. So as Tamara mentioned, I'm the director of the Center for Diversity and Community at the University of South Dakota. I live in Sioux Falls. I moved to Sioux Falls almost 3 years ago now, in 2018. And I've been in South Dakota since 2013. I started my career in the state as a faculty member at South Dakota State University in the history department. My master's and my PhD are both in the field of history from Rice University, and my specialty is African American studies. And so I was teaching courses in civil rights movement, intro to African American studies, early modern African American history. And, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion work really is, it's a way of life for me. It's something that I experience as a woman of color who has been both educated and now works in predominantly white institutions. I experience it as a scholar who writes and researches and theorizes about difference and about historically underrepresented populations. And it's also important to me in the work that I'm doing in my community. And I think that that's really when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and cultural competency, and a lot of these other topics, you know, we're concerned with our relationships to one another and creating a safer and healthier community for everyone that's inclusive of everyone. So it really is a passion of mine, and I'm happy to be here with you and share with you today.
Wonderful. I can't wait to nerd out with you on these concepts, Dr. Chandler. And Kiva, last but not least, do you want to share a little bit about your background?
So I'm Kiva. I'm from Pine Ridge. I grew up in Kyle, South Dakota, so part of this rural area. I am, you know, I have the privilege of having access to a lot of different resources in my life. I've been highly educated in a lot of westernized institutions. I attended Dartmouth. I'm currently in a doctoral program, so that's a privilege that I am bringing. I'm able-bodied, and I have all my basic economic needs met. A lens that I tend to operate from is, you know, I'm an Indigenous woman. I'm a mother. I am very critical. And so that's kind of how I approach a lot of different topics, not only this. And I kind of just want to share a quick story about why I'm here with all of you, because I've had an experience with an attorney. So when I was an undergraduate and my friend and I went to visit in LA. Dad's a lawyer, mom's a doctor, live in a very suburban part of Los Angeles. And we were driving to go eat dinner. And along that drive, you know, they're getting to know us, asking us questions. And I said, I'm from South Dakota. And he said, I've been there. I was stuck in a traffic jam. I had to wait at a stoplight all by myself. And so we laughed and joked. And he talked about this time he went and stole a sign. And we were laughing and was asking, you know, a sign. And he said, oh yeah, but it was from near the reservation, so they're probably too drunk to notice. And I'm gonna leave that there. And I'm gonna come back to that story a little bit later. But that is a highly educated attorney in Los Angeles that has a large Indigenous population.
Thank you, Kiva. So as you can see, we have a very esteemed panel with wonderful perspectives, differing perspectives, and I'm excited for us to jump in. I think first we should start our conversation with a level set. In defining some of the concepts you're going to hear us use throughout this conversation. And I think we should start with defining an acronym that we often hear, and you've already heard through the start of this program, DEI, or Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And Dr. Chandler, I'm going to turn to you as our academic expert. Would you mind defining what this concept means and how it interplays together?
Sure. Yeah. So as you indicated, you know, there's understanding the three words separately and what they mean, and then what they mean together and how they operate holistically. So diversity is really, it's the presence of social difference, right? It's the demographics, it's the numbers of difference. And there was, you know, not too long ago when people would use the term diversity, or an even older term like multiculturalism, they were often referring to, you know, racial identity or ethnic identity, sometimes religion, you know, maybe gender, but it usually focused on race and ethnicity. And in today's contemporary context, it's important that your definition of and understanding of diversity is as broad as possible, right? It should represent all of the social identity groups that exist within your profession, within your community, within your institution. And so that's not just race and ethnicity, it is nationality, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, religion. You know, I work at an institution of higher education, so veteran status is included in that as well. Disability, you know, both cognitive and physical. And there's even some, you know, debates recently about whether, you know, ideological differences and intellectual diversity is also a part of that as well. So, you know, having that really broad definition of the numbers of diversity that are present is important. Equity is about providing fair treatment and access and opportunity really for everyone, while also working to eliminate any barriers that have produced a disproportionate impact or outcome for some groups. And so it requires a recognition of the fact that, you know, there are many populations who are historically underserved, that they are historically underrepresented, and that fairness, not necessarily equality, right? Fairness is what is necessary. And that's the best way to address those imbalanced conditions. And the reason I emphasize fairness as opposed to equality is because, you know, giving everyone the same thing when not everyone has the same needs may not be the best way to is not the best way to deal with systemic inequities. And so it's about giving people what they need to succeed, providing conditions for success, but also thinking about laws and policies and practices that produce disproportionate outcomes, and how you can eliminate that. And then lastly, inclusion is about, you know, authentically bringing traditionally excluded people or groups to the table so that they have equitable access to resources, to services, but also to power, right? So if you are in an institution that is being very intentional and very aggressive about recruiting people from diverse backgrounds to your organization, that's really good, but it doesn't stop there, right? You know, is there mobility available to these individuals? Are there leadership positions available to them, executive positions? Are they able to drive the conversation at your institution or in your work? Are they able to inform policies or decisions? Or, you know, is there room for growth and room for them to be their whole selves? Or are they, you know, part of rank and file? And so there's a scholar in DEI who actually says that diversity is about being invited to the party, but inclusion is being asked to dance. And inclusion is really what impacts retention. That is what impacts whether a person is going to come back to you, right? Because if they feel seen, if they feel respected and valued and truly included, then they'll come back. But if they don't, they won't, right? They'll want to leave and no longer work with you. So the way that these things work together after defining them is that you really can't think about one without the other, right? You need that understanding, that broad understanding of diversity. You need a commitment to fairness, to justice, and an understanding of historical inequities. And then you also need a true interest in sharing power and sharing resources and uplifting the voices of those who have been traditionally excluded. And if you don't focus on all three of those things, then your policies and your initiatives will most likely be very anemic. And it won't lead to the kinds of transformative change that you really want to, that will really make an impact.
Wonderful. Such a beautiful explanation of it. I love your use of the words fairness and justice and this representation of agents of change, which is what the law is. That's what we're charged to do, our oath. So I think that's a beautiful segue into a conversation with lawyers specifically. The next thing I want us to define before we jump into content is our very discussion, cultural competency. When we use that term, Dr. Chandler, what are we talking about at a basic level, 50,000 foot view?
So essentially what you're talking about is how well you engage with difference, right? How well you engage and interact with individuals who are different from yourself. And so are you able to shift your perspective and your behavior in ways that are appropriate and authentic to engage with different cultural groups? And there really are two aspects to it. It requires that you understand yourself and understand your own cultural background and experience and context and how it has made you who you are as a person. But you also need that immersion and that experience with other groups of people, right? So recognizing, you know, if you are from you know, a small town where everyone was like you. And that was the case for me. I grew up in a community where everyone looked like me. Everybody at church looked like me. Really, the only time I was around different people was when I went to school, right? So that's true for a lot of people. And if you realize that that is your experience, you know, being successful in your career, in your life, in school, everything else, you will interact with people who are different than you. Your clients will be different than you. And so you'll need to have that ability to really shift that perspective and behavior to interact with them so that they feel comfortable, they feel connected, they feel seen and respected and heard.
Excellent. And before we dive deeper, I do want to remind our audience that at the end, we're going to take questions from you. So if you have questions, go ahead and pop them in the chat. I'll be watching, and we'll let our panelists answer anything that you want to ask as we're diving through the program. So in discussing cultural competency based on our definition now, we have that it's an understanding of culture and identity, but this can be something that's nuanced or multidimensional. So I'd like to talk about intersectionality. And Kiva, I'd like to turn it over to you. Can you tell us a little bit about what intersectionality is and how it plays into this conversation of cultural competency?
Yeah, so, you know, one of the things with cultural competency I also want to emphasize is just the word, you know, as attorneys, you know, language matters, right? So competency almost implies that there's this finality that comes to it, that you're going to be competent and it's there. I'd rather challenge you to think about it from a lens of cultural awareness and cultural consciousness, right? And so there are different elements. There's a spectrum depending on, you know, what Dr. Chandler was talking about, where you are with your own understanding of not only yourself, but also the relationships and empathetic understanding of others. And so I wanted to start with that. You know, and intersectionality is really, again, ties back to what she discussed in her definitions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's really the ways that all of who we are come into being, right? So when I introduced myself, I talked about one of the lens I approach from is as an Indigenous woman. Right? So it's not enough that woman captures my experiences and just being Indigenous doesn't capture my experiences, because both of those together are really different and unique compared to a lot of other people. I also talked about, you know, being able-bodied. And so I'm able to be afforded different, you know, accessibilities that aren't here. So one thing I see, right, as we're presenting right now, I'm also an advocate for people with disabilities, but I noticed there's not subtitles used on this screen. So I'm wondering about my people who are hard of hearing or deaf. Do they have access to this presentation? Right? And so, and are we looking at it from these different lenses so that, you know, every part of who we are comes into being? It could be gender, it could be sexual or identity, orientation, it could be religion, right? Because that's who I am as this unique person. And that captures the experiences and the lens that I look through things. And that's what intersectionality is about, is the different ways that we approach and bring ourselves to the table, but acknowledging those aspects of others as well.
Wonderful. I love that you capture that we all bring that to the table, no matter who we are and the lens that we see the world. That's excellent. So I've noticed a lot that cultural competency, not to use buzzword because sometimes it has a negative connotation with it, but a lot of industries seem to be focusing on this concept lately and its importance. So I'd like to step back and generally talk about why are we seeing this trend? Is this a conversation that we should be having just in our professional world? The three of us represent three different professions, or I should say the three of you rather. Why is this something to engage in, to talk about? Why do you think we're having this conversation? And Cesar, I'll kick it over to you so we get you talking here today.
Sure. Well, the short answer is, in my view, it's the right thing to do. You have to have these conversations. Now, later in our conversation, we'll get into, from the lawyer perspective, we'll get into the ethical rules and why we should be culturally competent. But before we even get into that, because we don't want to, you know, lawyers, we don't like to talk about ethics so much, and we're just getting started. So we'll save that for later. Let me get you interested with the business side of things. Demographics are changing. I am in private practice, have been in private practice my entire practice. And guess what? demographics are changing. What that means is if you're culturally competent, means happier clients, means more clients. Bottom line, more money for your firm, more business. I think that probably caught some people's attention. I've, over the years, like I said, I've been practicing for 8 years now. I've had the privilege of representing people and entities from all over the world. And I was really humbled when I was preparing for our conversation. I had to go back and think, and I started tallying some of these the places where I've represented folks from: Ecuador, Canada, Panama, the Ukraine, India, Guatemala, obviously the U.S., Mexico. I've had the privilege of representing at least one Native American tribe, folks that are Native American, folks with disabilities, folks who speak very little English. So I've been really blessed in that sense, and it all ties back to people that are different than the majority from minority groups, and they go looking for a lawyer, and they see this guy who looks kind of like them, who may talk kind of like them, who may be kind of smart, I guess. He did get through law school, and I get the phone calls. And so that's one reason I think that you, as new lawyers, can get your firms, or if you're going to go into private practice, you can get your firms to buy into this. It's good business in addition to being the right thing to do.
Excellent. Dr. Chandler, what are your thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, I agree with what Cesar just said as well. You know, the change is here. It's not, the change isn't coming. The change is here. You know, if we talk about those who are under the age of 18 right now, so people under the age of 18, and if they are white or Caucasian, they are already a minority, right, in their generation. And so if you look at what's happening just demographically in our society, politically, socially, you know, people who are even moving into our community, I see it here in Sioux Falls, right, every year. So it is changing. The change is here, and it's time to really be ready for it. It's important because of the research that we have about diverse teams, right? Diverse teams are really high performing teams. They're really high functioning teams. They can also be very low functioning teams, right? And the key difference between those two is how well they practice intercultural competence. You know, if you take a bunch of different people from different backgrounds and experiences and throw them into a room together, that doesn't mean that they're going to be successful. You know, how well is the difference within that group being leveraged? You know, is everything within that group done from top down, or, you know, is there an equitable distribution of input and power and resources within that group? That's what determines the success. And so, so that's incredibly important. You know, our society is changing around us, and we need to be ready to engage with all of the individuals that we're going to come into contact with on a daily basis in our professions.
Excellent. And I think we've already answered the question. Cesar certainly jumped into it, but let's talk specific to the legal profession. Why is this important to who we are as lawyers are charged to carry out justice and to represent those whom may have no other voice? Cesar, you are our legal expert for the day. I'll kick it back over to you.
Thanks for that denomination, Tamara, but I am far from an expert at anything. But above and beyond the business aspect that we've already talked about, I think most of us who are part of this conversation today and who have been through law school, we went to law school at some fundamental level because we believe in justice. And we want to be part of helping justice be served. It doesn't matter, it may be in a different context. It may be in the context of prosecuting folks accused of committing crimes. That's very noble. Some of you may want to do that. And you would have a definition of justice for that. Some of you maybe want to defend the accused. Some of you may want to represent folks who were injured in an accident. Some of you may want to represent businesses in negotiating deals. Some of you may want to go into public service, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever your definition may be, I think that at a core level, and I hope you agree with me, we all went to law school because we believe in justice. And so that brings me to connect the two together, cultural competency and justice. How can we as lawyers serve justice, help achieve justice, if we don't understand our clients? If we don't understand their culture, their background, what matters to them, what motivates them, what affects their behavior. I'm a trial lawyer, so we're always looking to tell a story. Before you can tell a story, a compelling story, you really need to understand what you're talking about. You need to immerse yourself. And to do that, how do you do it? I'll tell you how I do it. I check my assumptions at the door. I go into a conversation and I try not to assume anything, because I know that my experiences are probably a lot different than whoever my client is. And so if I come into that conversation assuming that my way is the way, or that my culture is the culture, or that my language is the language, then I've already inhibited the ability to really develop a meaningful conversation and relationship with that particular client. So to me, it all ties back to justice. If we as lawyers want to help serve justice, we need to really understand and be able to communicate and interact effectively with not only our clients, but also the lawyers on the other side, government officials, and the public as a whole.
Yeah, I also want to add to that. So I know I'm not an attorney, but I have a lot of opinions, and I used to think I wanted to go to law school. But one thing that I see this comment made me think about was, right, like when we think about why did you come into this profession, a lot of times it is about that ensuring justice, right? So I want to push back a little bit, and this is my critical lens that's coming in, is what is the purpose of justice? Is it punitive, restorative? Who is justice intending to serve? Right? And I pose these questions because our legal system actually leaves a lot of gray area. There's a lot of discretion that is there, right? It's about how can you persuade or sway the jury or the judge, right? And so there's a lot of error in that people can, bring some of their unconscious biases to the table. Cesar said, like, we need to check those at the door, but there are subtle ways that those start to come in that we may not always be aware about. And working on our cultural understanding and critical consciousness, we're able to start to get at some of those things. So for example, that story that I started off with the attorney, I started thinking about a lot of things in terms of how does he use some of these stereotypical views, and are these unconscious assumptions coming into the courtroom? And that's a way that the legal system perpetuates those stereotypes. And another thing I was thinking about too is if he represents an Indigenous individual, is that going to interfere or affect the quality of service that he dedicates towards his client? There's also recent court cases that came out of Mississippi at the Supreme Court level, the Curtis versus Flowers case. And in that, they ruled that it didn't pass the Batson test. This individual, Curtis Flowers, was sent to Mississippi Supreme Court, sentenced to life, and he had 6 trials. And each time they found that there was the prosecutor's preemptive strikes were used to prevent Black jurors from getting on the table and serving. And if we're talking about South Dakota specifically, and we're looking at, you could look at the response to the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. And Kristi Noem was very much advocating for a law to prevent and minimize and target Indigenous people from protesting the Keystone Pipeline. So those are ways in which our legal system, those gray areas, can start to impact, then it's not about just justice and ensuring the law equally, but it's about the different ways that the law is not favored for certain sets of people. And so I just kind of wanted to bring some of those specific examples as well.
Eva, you raise an interesting point with discretion, and Cesar as well with checking bias at the door. And to me, that raises an inquiry with our rules of professional conduct. We're charged to be competent and to be diligent. And to me, with implicit bias, at play, it challenges, to me, the notion of competency. Cesar, I'm curious your thoughts on how our ethical obligations tie in, butt up against or play into the conversation with cultural competency. What do you think?
They tie in hand. If we look at Rule 101, competence, I'll read it for all of us. A lawyer shall provide competent representation to a client. Competent representation requires the legal knowledge, skill, thoroughness, and preparation necessary for the representation. Rule 1.1 deals with diligence. I'll read that rule too. A lawyer shall act with reasonable diligence and promptness in representing a client. What does that mean to us as lawyers? As I said earlier, I do a lot of my work is in the litigation realm, but I also do some work with businesses. And when I am working with folks that are from a diverse background, it's especially important for me to understand where they come from, what motivates them, what the real goals are. I can't just assume that their goals are my goals. And that goes to competence and diligence. What do we need to do as lawyers? It takes a little work, but we need to do a little bit of research ahead of time before we meet with our clients. Say you get a cold call from somebody, and before you go and engage that person, before you have an in-person meeting or another phone call, do the work. Do a little bit of research. If it was somebody different than you, figure it out. What about that person's differences are important to that person, so that you are prepared when you walked into that second phone call or you walk into that second meeting. Again, as it relates to competence and diligence, how can we as lawyers represent somebody competently? I'll just do a very quick story from a current client that I have. I'm representing this clients, I should say. I'm representing this family from Guatemala. During our very first phone call, I had a very difficult time communicating with them. I couldn't figure it out why. They're from Guatemala, they speak Spanish. I'm from Mexico, I speak Spanish. Well, then we had a meeting in person, and I learned that yes, the family is from Guatemala, but they are from an indigenous community in Guatemala. Spanish is their second language. They speak a native dialect, a native language from Guatemala. I would have never known that. I could have just assumed, hey, they're from Guatemala, they speak Spanish, I speak Spanish, let's figure this out. During that meeting, I also learned very important family dynamics. I can't share a whole lot of details with you because they are my clients, but these very important family dynamics, which are not quote unquote normal, are very important to my representation of this family. They will make a huge difference in how I go about representing them and what I do or don't do if and when this ends up in a court. And so this is just one example. It's just happening. It's unfolding in my practice as we speak. And I could have made a lot of assumptions I could have even turned away this particular client because I had a difficulty communicating with this family. So that's just one example. And it goes, again, it took me a little work to figure it out that they speak a native indigenous language. And I had to do some research. I had to call some contacts that I know to try to figure it out. Help me out here. I have this family. They're from Guatemala. This is the area that they're from. I can't communicate with them very effectively. What do I do? What do you know? And luckily, somebody very quickly from my network said, they're from the Quiche region. They speak Quiche. Here's what you need to know. So it took extra work, but once you get that done and you get to know the family, you build a relationship, and it is so rewarding. And you comply with the rules of ethics.
And knowledge moving forward.
I love the focus on relationships. It's come up in all three of your comments on why this matters and where we should go. And I think we'd be remiss if we don't talk about a specific relationship with a specific demographic. As it relates to interactions with and the representation of Native Americans. I think, as most of you know, our Native American population is the largest minority population here in our state. So I'd be interested in each of your perspective of how cultural competency is at play, specific to lawyers' representation of and developing relationships with Native Americans, specific to our state's unique history with and relationship with Native Americans. And Kiva, I'm going to kick it off to you. What are your thoughts?
Well, I have quite a bit of thoughts. If you don't mind, can you just come back, because I want to let them have the chance to.
Dr. Chandler?
Oh, okay. Sorry, I had trouble hearing Kiva for a second. Sorry about that. No, I think it's incredibly important. And I can say it was important for me as well, you know, as someone not being from here. I came from North Carolina. And so, you know, South Dakota was a very different context for me. And I realized that I needed to do a lot of work. I needed to learn a lot of history. I needed to have more engagement with Indigenous communities to understand their needs. And I had to do a lot of listening. You know, I think often in our positions as professionals, we're used to being the people in the room who do the talking. And part of intercultural competence is realizing there are moments where you just need to listen and you need to understand the experience of whether it's a client or a student or a patient, you know, whoever your target demographic is. And so that's something that I have found is incredibly important in working with Indigenous communities. It's all about the relationships that you build and being consistent and being trustworthy in those relationships.
Cesar, any thoughts you'd like to share?
I agree with everything that Dr. Chandler said. To me, it comes back down to, and I ask myself this every time with every new client, every new case that I have, is if it's going to be a litigation case that may end up in court, my question is always, how am I going to tell the most compelling story to advocate for my client? And to answer that question, I need to go back and I need to understand the client or the clients. And to do that, I need to be willing to learn, and I need to, more than anything, I need to not make assumptions, and I need to check my stereotypes. I can't stereotype my clients, because if I do, they may be less willing. Well, let me rephrase that. They will be less willing to be open with me about what may be really important to their case. And so if anybody, if you've listened to me ramble during our conversation today, if you take one thing away, let it be this. Don't assume, leave your assumptions at the door when you are going to meet with new clients. Go in there with an open mind, be willing to learn, and don't just give them lip service of, oh yes, I understand this is your way, but this is my way. Instead, really listen. And by the end of that meeting, instead of saying that's your way, this is my way, I challenge you to say, this is our way.
Yeah, I love that. You know, I think, so one thing that I also want to bring up is when people meet me, I'm very racially and ethnically ambiguous, right? So I get Puerto Rican a lot, depending on where I'm at. Mexican, I get half black, half white. I never get Indigenous. So I'm putting that out there because once people, one of the things I look at is once people learn that I'm Indigenous and I grew up on the reservation in South Dakota, I get a deer in headlights look for a second, you know? And part of that is because I'm also very outspoken and I'm very direct. And so I think I defy a lot of those stereotypes that are held against Indigenous people. I get microaggressive comments like, oh, you're from the res, but you're really smart. And I'm just like, okay. And, you know, so I kind of want to put that out there for a second because I have the privilege of navigating those different spaces. And so, you know, when we're talking about Indigenous peoples and their relationships, I can speak for a lot in my community. We're very relational. You come and visit us, we'll invite you in for coffee, we'll feed you. We may not have a lot, but that is what we're going to give you. Our focus is on not what we have, but what we can give away. And I think that's a very critical place to understand that there's these stereotypes that are there, but we generally, a lot of us do have that open heart. And I really liked what both of my colleagues have talked about in terms of like understanding that history, right? It's if you're from South Dakota and you come here, you can cut the tension between non-native and native very, very clearly. I would say it is more prominent West River, especially when certain events happen that sparks those just those passions, I guess, you know. And so it's very important to kind of just think about the ways that we're interacting, think about the ways that our understanding of biases are influenced. You know, there's a lot of people who have never been to the reservation, who, even though it's a requirement to understand the history of Indigenous peoples in South Dakota, a lot of people don't. And when we're talking, and what that I'm kind of getting at is there's a, you know, one of the buzzwords to use, right, is, you know, trauma responsive or trauma focused, right? And a lot of people, especially in South Dakota, will say, oh, but that's a thing in the past. That was 100 years ago. I wasn't here for that. But what we need to understand is those effects continue, right? Is it's not just 100 years ago. If I was to say that, that is my great-great-grandma, right? So we have those stories that get passed down to us. So we hear the things that happen. And on paper, it may have been 100 years ago, but the legacies and oppressions continue today. And so when we're talking about trauma and we're talking about, you know, let's take in working in trial court, right? Our population in the prison for Indigenous people is very high, disproportionately high. And when we're wondering why do people keep offending, and, you know, when we're talking about equity, and it's really about, do we remove those systemic barriers? Because a lot of times our punitive measures is putting a Band-Aid on the situation. We're not addressing the root cause. And so I challenge you, when you think about the relationships you're building, not only with Native peoples and organizations, but even think about the partnerships you've developed in the community. Because we can't talk about criminal justice unless we're going to talk about unequal access to housing. If we're not going to talk about unequal and affordable opportunities for high quality education, if we're not going to talk about access to transportation, you know, those are the different ways. Each one of these may be outside of your sphere, but they all connect and relate. So how do we become more strategic with our goals to ensure, you know, quality of life for all? So long story short.
No, that's wonderful. I think it's so powerful that each of you touched on humility and education as the foundation of where you start. And so that segues wonderfully. So thank you all for setting it up for me to where I'd like to take our conversation next. So we know these key principles, we know why they matter, why they are relevant to the legal profession, but let's talk about what really matters: action. Tangible steps for our profession. What would each of you identify as the next step forward to maintaining this cultural competency? Kiva, you said it so well that this isn't a one and done. It's a growing process. It's a continual process. It's not attend a webinar and now you're woke and you know it all. So how do we encourage these attendees to take the next steps forward after attending today's program? And Dr. Chandler, I'd like to kick it off with your thoughts.
As a two, oh, there we go. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, sorry, my computer was telling me I was muted. So I really see it as a two-step process, and action is absolutely a part of that. But it also includes self-reflection, right? And it is an ongoing process. I don't think that there's ever a point where, you know, as Kiva was saying, that you do the work and then you have it. It's a continual process of learning and committing yourself to this work. And that's true for me as well. But, you know, beginning with self-reflection and thinking about your own socialization and your own worldview, right? So in being willing to interrogate your own position and your own privilege. So, you know, one thing that I find in the work that I do, with white communities is that there's a challenge in encouraging people to realize that whiteness is a racial identity, right? That you are also racialized, right? And there's a position and privilege that goes along with that. Even having those letters after your name, that is a privileged position that needs to be recognized. Understanding the systemic nature of inequality and racism, both in your field and in your community. And I think that is really a baseline competency. It's hard to come into this work without recognizing that racism and other forms of inequality really are systemic and they're structural. And that doesn't just mean that racism is everywhere, but there are laws and policies and practices that lead to disproportionate outcomes and impacts for different social groups. And you have to understand the history leading up to those relationships and be willing to do the work to do that. In terms of taking action, you know, you think about your sphere of influence, right? As lawyers and as attorneys, you can interrogate the content of any programs or policies or initiatives or the work that you're doing. Where can you eliminate barriers to success for underrepresented or marginalized communities? Calling out racist policies and practices when you are aware of them. And using your skills and your talents to further your community. You know, we talked about the business aspect of this, but there's also the service that we owe to those around us and to our community, right? And so where are those places where you know you have a skill set that is incredibly valuable? And it's a skill set that can be very, very helpful to underrepresented or marginalized individuals in our community. Where can you put those skills into service to help others? And then, you know, I think another one that's really important to emphasize, because I find in my profession, we often focus on the needs of students. And I imagine, you know, in your profession, you think about the needs of clients, but it's also really important to think about your colleagues as well, right? And colleagues who are from systemically non-dominant or underrepresented populations, you know, especially in moments like this, you know, your colleagues of color, your colleagues from other underrepresented groups are really stretched thin at the moment, right? I mean, I'm sure they're being asked to, you know, talk in a lot of webinars like this to teach others about their experiences. They're also dealing with it, you know, dealing with whatever trauma they've experienced as someone from an underrepresented population. They're trying to help others. And so also think about the things that you can do to support those colleagues around you who are really stretched thin and maybe having a hard time at the moment. So those are some of the things I would focus on.
Wonderful. Cesar, what are your thoughts?
I agree with everything that Dr. Chandler has said. I think that one of the things that may be difficult for us young lawyers, and particularly our new admittees, it may be difficult for you, or you may think it's difficult for you to go back to your firm or the office where you work and share some of what you've learned today, because there may be a negative connotation by some of the old school way of doing things at your firm or your office where you work. And so my challenge to you is face those fears, be brave, share what you've learned today with the people at your office, at your firm. I will. As soon as we get out with, we get done here today, I'm going to send the link to the video to everybody in my firm. And I will invite them to have conversations with me about this. Because as Dr. Chandler said very eloquently, the first part of this is self-reflection, and it continues. It doesn't end today. We don't know everything there is to know. We need to continue learning and evolving. Our state, our world will continue to change, and we as lawyers need to be flexible and need to change with it in order to continue to be competent and to be ethical. And the second part of what Dr. Chandler said that I also agree with, it's take action. And that's where I challenge you to take action and not staying quiet anymore. Voice your opinions about these things that you're learning today. Don't just let this be one of those CLEs conversations that you attend because you have to and then never think about it again. Challenge your own assumptions. I do this all the time, and I am privileged that my wife puts up with it because her and I, we do it to each other. We like to travel quite a bit, so we'll be in a city where, by the way, I love traveling to big cities where there is a lot of diversity. It's my happy place. I walk one block and I hear a bunch of different languages. I cross a bunch of people that look a lot differently than me. But in any event, I digress. My wife and I, when there'll be times where she'll call me on my assumptions. If I make a comment that is completely out of bounds, she'll stop me and she said, "You need to check yourself." Well, she's nicer than that, so she'll use nicer words. But she does that to me, and I do that to her too. Because we need to. If we are going to encourage and help others change, we ourselves need to practice what we preach.
Eva, you want to bring us home? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I love everything that they said. And I think really one of my mottos is own your own personal and professional development, right? So I'm very much a self-learner. So I like to read. I like to reflect a lot. I like to look at different viewpoints. I like to have conversations with people who are different than me. I have a lot of my partner's friends who have completely different political views, and we have really rich discussions. And it's not like we're trying to change each other, but it's helping us to understand each other's viewpoints. It's helping us to understand, and there's some things that they persuade me on, and some things that I've persuaded them on to change, So for example, they're more mindful about language they use. They don't use and I'm going to say it because they don't use like the words fag or retarded around me because we built that personal relationship and they know that it bothers me. So for me, that's a small change, but I also understand where they're coming from, and that's the power of personal relationships. Professionally, one thing I think all of you can take away, and I think Caesar talked about this earlier, but even when you're meeting your clients, even asking them at some point during that conversation, are there any cultural considerations that I should know about you or that is important to that, for me to get to know you as a person? And then I think about in South Dakota, right? There's rural farm culture. That's a very big aspect of our environment. They may be white, but rural farm culture is real. There's a West River culture and an East River culture that are very, very different. So those are different ways to think about culture. In terms of some practical things as well that you can do is get creative. I don't know if the bar or your company or organization you work for requires pro bono hours or CLEs, but use that to partner with an organization or a group that you typically don't see or serve or represent often. It may be a little bit uncomfortable, but that's kind of a taste what a lot of different marginalized populations go through every single day. So just kind of be aware of that. Have humility. We don't expect you to know everything. Because we don't, Caesar earlier said, I'm not an expert. Very humble of you, Caesar, but you know quite a bit. And thank you for sharing your knowledge across the board. Having humility with your clients, because without them, you don't have a job. Your service and they're your customers. And so it's important to get to know them. And then last, I know Dr. Chandler talked about, but leverage your power and the ways of being an ally. So that story that I talked about at the beginning with an attorney experience, right? And after that, I froze And I didn't know what to say. I'm like, did I just hear him say that natives are too drunk to notice? And it was his son who spoke up, and not even our friend, our friend's little brother was the one who spoke up. And he said, wow, that was awkward. And his girlfriend said, well, why was that awkward? And he said, because they're both native. And the silence in that car for the next 4 minutes was very, very uncomfortable. But I was so thankful for that, because had he not said anything, I don't think I would have. And it's hard, as having to be the one to speak up a lot, is sometimes it's exhausting and it's tiring. So any way that you can use your privileges and power to help a friend, a colleague, a different group, or think about the ways you can do that.
Wonderful. Well, we're nearing time to the end, but there's one question I really just want to ask, and I'll have you guys give us the lightning round answer, which totally doesn't do it justice. But I'm just so moved by the comments each of you gave, and it speaks volumes to the power of amplifying others' voices, and the power of influence and the power of humility. And I truly believe that there's so much that a personal story can really give someone else in learning and humility and grace. So to that end, if any of you are comfortable, I'd like for you to share a story and how cultural competency, either one, gave you professionally a positive experience where you learned, someone else learned, or two, was a negative experience, and maybe kind of gave that uncomfortable standalone, being an island experience that Kiva's talking about. So I guess, Dr. Chandler, I'll turn it over to you, or if there's something you want to share or no, that's fine.
Yeah. Oh gosh, there's so many, so many experiences that I could think about, especially negative experiences with cultural competency. But I go back to we've mentioned the importance of relationships, so much, and really that's what this is about. That's what we're talking about. If you make a cultural reference that someone doesn't understand or is really insensitive, you've lost an opportunity there to really build a good relationship with that person. And in our work and in our professions, that's incredibly important in what we do. And so, for me, I changed the institution that I worked for a few years ago because I just did not I could not see myself reflected in the institution where I was working and in the office where I was working. And specifically as a woman of color, as an academic of color, I just could not see a way forward in that place. And now, I work for someone who I feel like sees me as a whole person. And it's probably the happiest that I've been in my professional life, that someone who recognizes, even with this summer, with the events that was happening after the murder of George Floyd, I was having an incredibly hard time focusing. I could not pay attention to anything. And I had to tell my supervisor, I really just need to step back for a little bit so that I can recenter and take care of myself and then come back to the work. And she was incredibly empathetic about that. And I thought of how fortunate I am to be in a position, to work with someone who understands that and can appreciate that and understand how uniquely I was affected as a woman of color by the events of this summer. So, so that would be my example.
That's amazing. It's quite telling and powerful to be seen. So thank you for sharing. That's awesome. Cesar, I'm going to have you wrap up with a story if you'd like to share.
Absolutely. I have tons of stories to share. So I have to, but because we're short on time, I'll tell you two very, very quick ones. The first one happened to me in February of 2018. I was in Shreveport, Louisiana for a month, trying a case with a couple of my partners at the time. And this is a huge case, biggest one I've ever been a part of, millions of dollars at stake. The judge, unfortunately, was not kind to me and my partners. The biases were not implicit. They were explicit. We were called Yankees. The judge was incredibly one-sided against my partner, who was the lead counsel in that case, because she was a woman, and the judge just apparently could not believe that a woman was lead counsel in this huge case. And I was referred to as the IT guy. So that's I'll leave that there. You can draw your own conclusions. The other story happened to me. I was trying a case in Woodbury County in Sioux City, Iowa. And by this time, and you will learn that by the time you try a case, you've interacted with the other side, the parties and the lawyers. You've interacted with them for a long time, years, most of the time. So this, we're in the middle of trial, and I'm cross-examining one of the owners of the other company. I've deposed this guy. I had him in a deposition for pretty much all day, so he knows me well. He knows how I speak. He knows that, yes, I have an accent. English is not my first language, but I don't usually have issues communicating in the English language. And if you are like me and you learned how to cross-examine witnesses from Professor Horton, you know that you ask very short statements of fact, not questions. So I'm doing this, and I think I was doing a fine job asking very short statements of fact. And this witness, he kept every time, he kept telling me he did not understand and kept asking me to repeat and kept asking me to repeat. So at one point, it became obvious to me, this guy's making fun of my accent in front of the jury. So what do? I asked him on the record, Mr. So-and-so, are you making fun of my accent? After that, his answers were yes, sir, no, sir. In the jury, you could hear a pin drop when I asked that question.
Wow. Definitely powerful stories. I want us to draw to a close with answering a couple audience questions. We'll take 3 to 4 more minutes. But Dr. Chandler, I know you have a prior commitment, so feel free to log off anytime. We certainly want to be respectful of your schedule, but I do want to thank you in front of everyone for your insight and your perspective. You're just a total rock star. I so appreciate and admire you. Thank you. We got 2 really great questions from the audience. And the first one is suggestions that you all might have about handling cultural incompetence from a supervising attorney. And if Dr. Chandler, if you want to chime in first, you can. Certainly don't feel any pressure, but I'll turn it over to you guys. What do you think about how someone in a lower position handles that?
So yeah, sorry, I need to prepare for another presentation, so I'm gonna step
No
out.
problem. Yep. Thank you. Cesar, do you want to tackle that one?
I will do my best, and I mean the short answer is it's not easy. It's incredibly hard and scary. But what I've done, and what I have, and I continue to do is, if I feel that I can't talk to my supervisor, whoever that may be, about a topic that is very important to me, then I go back and ask the question, why am I here? And I've been lucky and blessed to not have to leave a job because of the answer to that question. So I wish I had actual tips on how to do it, but I mean, it all comes down to how you approach it, I think, and approaching it in the way that shows that you're not attacking anybody. You're not calling anybody the names that have negative connotations or making assumptions. Approaching it as a conversation. For example, say so-and-so, the other day I heard or saw you do X. Tell me about that. Why was that okay? Or why did you feel the need to say or do those things? What did it accomplish? Use the skills that you've learned in law school of how to interview people. as to who, the what, the why, and all of the above. And that'll guide that discussion. If you ask the questions in a open, not attacking way, and the response is a overwhelming attack or defensive response, then I think you'll know your answer. And I think that you'll, unfortunately, if you're anything like me, you'll have to go back and ask yourself, do I want to be here and work with this individual or individuals? I've been lucky enough that, and I think all of us probably have or will at some point encounter those difficult situations. And I've been lucky enough that when it's happened in the workplace, sometimes I think about it, and I go home and I slip on it, and I think of, how can I approach this? And sometimes I don't even have to, because the colleague or colleagues who said something they shouldn't have said, they approach me and they realize, oops, I said something I shouldn't have said. Here's why I said it. Here's why it's not okay. And it becomes a learning experience for all of us. Other times, I sleep on it, and I try to go back and ask the questions in a non-offensive way, because the last thing I want to do is to create more division. I'm trying to bridge a gap, not create a wider one. I don't know if any of this helps the person to pose the question. I hope it does. If whoever posed the question wants to talk to me offline, you can find all my contact information either on our website, lynnjackson.com, or on the State Bar directory. I check my email regularly, and I pick up the phone whenever I'm at the office. And if you leave a voicemail, I will make a point to call you back.
I think that's, oh, sorry, go ahead, Kiva.
I will add to that very quickly, because I'll let you know how direct I am. And this is something I'm working on, right? It's the opposite. So I'm very, I have ADHD as well. So I'm most slightly impulsive. So sometimes I just blurt what comes out. And I've had supervisors, professors tell me that I was intimidating. And so that's how direct I am. And what that has done, though, is it helped me think about my communication style and who I'm communicating with. You know, so the people that I've heard that from tend to be more opposite of me. They tend to be either more introverted. They tend to be a little bit more of, what's the word? Like Caesar was talking about, they take it a little bit more personally, and I don't intend for it to be personal, but that's my issue in terms of how I'm communicating. So now I try to preface it. I want to be proactive. So this is what I'm saying, you know, but again, it comes to that relationship. People who you have that relationship with are going to know those things about you, you know, but sometimes supervisors aren't used to being called out because they're in positions of power. So saying something like, that's racist, or that's a problem, and this is why, you know, and if not, you know, I tend to, like I said, at one time I wanted to be a lawyer, so I make sure legally I'm always covered. So if I tried, I document it. I document the time, the day it happened. If it happens again, I report that to HR. I talk about creating a racially hostile environment or a sexually hostile environment. And those are my steps. So those are, but again, sometimes people just aren't used to being challenged and having those conversations.
Wonderful. I think you guys touched on quite a bit of the key of humility and education, but also being courageous, which is very difficult in these spaces, especially if you're a person who identifies as a diverse person. With that, I want us to wrap up our conversation today. We're running close on time. Today has been a very engaging conversation on a critical topic. Cultural competency. I think flat bank is a needed tool in the 21st century lawyer's toolkit. We have learned that practicing cultural competency enables legal professionals to better understand their clients through enriched relationships and empowers our ability to serve justice in pursuance of our solemn oath. I encourage each of you to engage and grow in this conversation by seeking resources that empower you, but also enriches your practice. I encourage each of you to be the change and to be courageous. I'd like to, of course, thank our all-star panel, Cesar Juarez, Kiva Sam, and of course, Dr. Chandler. And lastly, I'd like to thank each of you for joining in. This is a pretty first of its kind CLE, so I'm so ecstatic to see each of you here. If you have any questions, please submit them to the State Bar at info@sdbar.net. We can direct them to our panel. And once you leave today's webinar, a survey will pop up. We would love your feedback on how you enjoyed today's panel. And on behalf of the State Bar of South Dakota, as well as our panelists, we thank you for joining in. Take care.